Alexei de Tocqueville was a French diplomat and a historian back in the mid-1800s, and he came to visit the United States because in France they're trying to decide what are they doing over there across the ocean. So they came over to study it, and he traveled around the country at that time and talked to people, and at the end, this is what he found. He said, "I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her commodious harbors and her ample rivers, but it was not there. In her fertile fields and boundless prairies, but it was not there. In her rich mines and her vast world commerce, but it was not there. Not until I went to the churches of America and I heard the pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because she is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." Prophetic words from almost 200 years ago, being able to acknowledge the role that God was playing in the hearts of the people of this country. And a lot of people are trying to make America great again. But I think that Alexei found the secret back then of what made America great. And it reminds us today, if we want to be great again, it's going to start with righteousness. It's going to start with people whose hearts are aflame for the Lord. And we can go back to that, and that's where we're headed today. We need righteousness preached from our pulpits, not soft, lovey-dovey, squeaky, clean stuff. We need to know that we need to be able to live righteously. We need it preached in our homes. We need parents that aren't going to be soft on their kids, but teach them what's right and what is wrong by their example and by their words. We need not just righteousness preached, but we need it lived out as an example to stand up and go against the flow. Even if we're in the minority, that we are going to do what's right and not go with the course of the world that's telling us a different story. We need righteousness lived out by people who understand that the rights that are given to us in our Constitution for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness aren't there to make us more selfish, but to make us more giving. Just as Kim talked about with this basket up here. The more that we are able to give, the more blessed we are. You know, we have lost a lot of our rights, and everybody's claiming we want our rights. The child in the womb has lost its rights. Women lose their rights. Ethnic minorities lose their rights. Sexual minorities lose their rights. The working class loses rights. The business class loses rights. Retirees lose their rights. The refugees lose their rights. The Christians lose their rights, and the Muslims lose their rights. Everybody's complaining that we're losing our rights. So we have a lot more in common with everybody else in America. It doesn't matter what your niche is. We're all struggling for our rights. And what happens is we become seeing each other as enemies, as minorities, whatever minority group you find yourself in, and even that list that I gave. We struggle to be able to find unity, and we blame the other groups for our loss of rights. And we need to come together and support one another because we have a lot more in common. And the more we can work together for everybody's rights, the best we're going to do to be able to bring those back again. We look for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. It's not about my life, but our lives. What can I do to make our lives more enriching? It's not just about my liberty, but it's about our liberty. What can I do to make us all more free? It's not about just my pursuit of happiness, but our happiness. What can I do to be able to bring joy to my neighbors, even if they're in a totally different group than I belong to? Our core greatness isn't in our economy, our military, our political process, our scientific achievements, our expressions of creativity. It's not in our work ethic or our beautiful nature or our natural resources. These are all great. But at the core, we are greater when we acknowledge the greatness of God and we allow Him to be able to live through us, to bring His majesty through our lives and into our land. Some of the early settlers of America were virtuous Christian people. Many came here because they were looking for freedom to be able to express their worship and their religion, as they were not always allowed to do so back in their home countries. But actually, they were the minority. They were the minority. The majority of people who came to America in those early days were not righteous Christian people. England, among other countries, they saw the American soil and the colonies as a way to get rid of the layer of society that they didn't want in their own countries. The peasants, the criminals, the debtors. In a way, they could send their riffraff across the ocean to clean up their own country. But the riffraff, for lack of a better word, saw it as an opportunity to start over again. And so it kind of worked both ways. The countries in Europe were cleansing out, getting rid of their undesirables, but those undesirables came here. So there was a lot of riffraff that weren't as the Christian virtuous people at all. They didn't have that Christian belief. They were not people of faith. And this is where some of the attitudes in the early days, the fact that we were so cruel towards the Native Americans, the fact that we were so cruel towards the African slaves, it comes because in the early days when this was all going on, we were not really a Christian nation. About the same time that the nation was being established by a lot of riffraff and those looking for religious freedom, it was the Age of Enlightenment. Across Europe, there were people who had decided that the advancements of humankind were so great that we don't need God anymore. We've been able to accomplish much. And so these people that were part of the Enlightenment began to say, well, we don't really need God anymore in our lives. And a lot of these people said, we want to go to America as well because we want to be able to get rid of all the baggage that we have in our European countries. And we want to be able to start in a new land in a way that we can capitalize on the human endeavors and the human achievement and be able to create a society that's even more perfect than where we've come from. And these people were typically called deists. They were people that maybe believed that there was a God, but that God just had his hands off, and people, humankind, could make this world a great place. And so you really had three groups of people in the early colonies. You did have the people that were there for religious freedom, devout Christian people. You had the riffraff that were people without God, and you had the deists who lived their lives very fine without God. And so really, I don't know the percentages of what they were, but we were not established in the very beginning as a real Christian nation at that time. But you know what? In the years 1740 to 1760, about 120 years after the first pilgrims came over, God in his mercy sent a spiritual awakening to the United States. It wasn't the United States at the time, to the colonies. During this time, people began to sense the presence of God. People began to preach about God. And during this time, the number of people in the churches more than doubled. Whole towns were converted to Christ. Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, not a Christian at all, he wrote in his autobiography, he said, "It seemed as if all the world were growing religious. So one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms being sung in different families on every street." This was the time that great schools and universities were being founded. The great Ivy League schools began as seminaries to be able to propagate the understanding of God and theology and to prepare people to go into the world and spread the gospel. During this era, people began creating schools in their communities where they used the Bible as the textbook, as a way to learn to read and to write and to learn the values that could make a person successful in life. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Wesley, they would preach, travel around, calling people to repentance. And people were responding by great numbers and dedicating their lives to God. And this would be the time when you could say, yes, America was becoming a Christian nation because of the spiritual awakening that was taking place during that time. A very rich time in our history. And as people began to turn to God, they began to have more of a desire for independence, to be their own country. And many believe that without this great awakening, there wouldn't have been the revolution in the 1770s that we have today. Because part of the preaching that would take place in the pulpit would start to use sermons that used biblical imagery to describe England as like the evil Egypt, and King George was the wicked Pharaoh. And worse yet, he is even called the Antichrist by many. America was the promised land. Just as the Hebrews were under a yoke of slavery, the colonists were under a yoke as well of the taxation without representation and having to submit to England. And so the idea of political freedom with the biblical imagery began to swell, and people began to think, this is God's will that we separate and become our own nation. And that idea rose because God was working in people's hearts to be able to say, we need to do something to make this nation what they felt it needed to be. You know, it was a Christian nation, but it still had a lot of holes in it. Because even though the Declaration of Independence speaks of all men being created equal, it was not taken literally, because blacks and Native Americans were not equal with Europeans. Women were not equal with men. Men who were not landowners were not equal with those who did own land. So it wasn't a perfect place. It still wasn't heaven yet. But the experiment had begun. Many Christians were a part of the movement. They weren't necessarily creating a Christian nation, but a nation of Christians. In the Constitution, it never mentions Jesus. It never mentions God. It doesn't even use vague words like providence. It doesn't mention religion or Christianity or the Bible. It's a pure political document. Our Constitution is political. Now, the First Amendment comes along and says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In other words, the First Amendment wanted to keep religion out of the government because that had been abused every place else before. But it didn't mean that religious people could not be part of the government and help to lead. And so there's a distinguishing factor there. They didn't want to create a national church. They didn't want that politics and religion to be tied like in the countries where they had come from that caused a lot of problems. So while there was respect towards religion, it was not created, this country, as a religious nation, in a political way, as a theocracy. The government was not allowed to start a church or endorse a certain church or religion, but to protect the rights of citizens to worship according to their conscience, and that churches would always be free to preach, teach, and minister as they wished. And that was the intent at the beginning. And fortunately today, we are able to do that. These things have been. There's a little bit of opposition to this. We're having a little bit of trouble finding the lines between religion and politics. We're struggling with that today. But it does exist, and we go back to the beginning, and that is what our founding fathers wanted to happen. Separation of church and state was never meant to exclude religion from the ideas of the people and the government. The Judeo-Christian ethic that was out of there at the time was very much honored by our founding fathers. Even those that were deists, like Benjamin Franklin, they appreciated the values that came with Christianity, and they wanted people to be able to embrace those things because they were good things that advanced humankind. So even if they didn't acknowledge the God behind the values, they at least acknowledged the values that were there. There are many countries in the world where democracy doesn't work very well because those values are not part of the people's system. Without righteousness, it's very difficult to have democracy and freedoms because they're going to be abused. And in countries where the experiment has began in democracy, they've found that dishonesty, selfishness, power to the strong, disrespect for human lives have failed to bring about a sort of democracy that has worked in this land. And it worked in this land because of that attitude of righteousness that was there, that God sent through that great awakening back in the mid-1700s. Our founding fathers understood that people make the best citizens when they live according to righteousness. Righteousness will be a blessing to the land. And 242 years later, we celebrate the birth of our nation, and we see a lot of cracks in the righteousness. We see where righteousness has taken a back seat to selfishness. Everybody demanding their own rights and their own way. A new generation struggles with race issues, making us wonder if anything was really accomplished back in the 60s. All the school shootings and every place else that goes on, the violence, brings up the national argument. about who's to blame and what do we do about it. In so many ways, our nation today is looking like the description of how it's going to be in the last days. In 2 Timothy 3, we read, "Understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power." And you could use this description to talk about different places and different times all through, but unfortunately, this list, we could all say, describes much of our nation today. Not that it's all bad. There's an awful lot of good here. Righteousness still exists, and we see it around us every day. But the dark side is creeping in and making a difference in a negative way. And we need to pray that God will send another great awakening. And would you agree with me that our country needs that right now? We need to find righteousness again in order to become great. In Psalm 33:12, we're told, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And not just nation as in a political, but a group of people. Nations are people that are brought together in unity under Jesus Christ, under the God of heaven. And we have that in situations like this. I mean, we're blessed to be a part of congregations of people who worship God, and we find unity with one another. Even though we're all very different, we're able to come together in unity because of our faith, of our common faith. And we need to bring this into our nation, a nation of people whose God is the Lord, so that we can have more in common with each other, even as we're all dealing with our own minority statuses. We're in this together. There's nothing wrong for standing up with what you believe in or speaking your beliefs, but we need to be careful not to let standing for what we believe in be fingers pointing to the enemy. Jesus told us we need to do what? We need to love our enemies, be kind to them, pray for them. You know, we don't have enemies in this country. We have other friends who are struggling with the same things we are, but in different ways. And we, as Christians, can take the higher road of righteousness and reach out to them. Let's shake hands. Let's find what we do have in common. And let's work together to make this country a better place. And as more and more hearts are turned to God through the bridges that we make instead of the walls that we build, we'll be able to see righteousness take hold. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, is a call back for righteousness. Righteousness means doing what's right in the sight of God, not because we're good people, but because we're God's people. And we're consumed with the desire to follow Him. A great awakening is what we need in our land so that people will hunger and thirst after righteousness. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied." And judgment starts with the house of God. Do we hunger and thirst for righteousness? We can't expect people out there to hunger and thirst for it if we do not set the pace and lead the way. And so my prayer for us today and our prayer for us as we go into this birthday of our country, are we committed to righteousness? Are we hungering and thirsting for it? Are we setting the standard high, what God has given us? Not picking and choosing what God said to do and picking our favorite easy things to do, but are we really setting the standard high for ourselves? And can we pray for that as a nation? That God would send, through His mercy, a great awakening again. Where, wouldn't it be great if a great awakening came and we could say that attendance in churches doubled across our land? That would make a difference, a huge difference in our country. If anything, it's been going the other direction and diminishing. So let's stand firm on who we are. Let's pray for God's mercy, pray for His awakening, and allow Him to do great things in us. Let me pray as we go into our closing song about worshiping Him in spirit and in truth.